Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide shows the live logo in gold on a white background with the text, "Live from NYPL presents The Words That Made Us, Akhil Reed Amar with Jeffrey Rosen, June 3rd, 2021, 8 p.m. Eastern Time." This slide contains an image of the featured title. The background appears to be an aged parchment paper with the title in large print with 2 lines in blue and red below. The text reads, Akhil Reed Amar, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. The Words That Made Us is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with the New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats. nypl.org/live. The last slide shows recommended reading. Akhil Reed Amar and NYPL suggest these titles for further reading. America's Constitution, a Biography by Akhil Reed Amar. The Hemmingses of Monticello by Annette Gordon Reed. Ratification by Pauline Mayer. The Supreme Court by Jeffrey Rosen. Revolutionary Characters by Gordon S. Wood. Check out the full list and reserve these titles by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us again at Live from NYPL. I'm Julie Golia, and I'm the Curator of History, Social Sciences, and Government Information at the New York Public Library. Tonight, it's my good fortune to introduce Akhil Reed Amar and Jeffrey Rosen. They're here to talk about Akhil's new book, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. Akhil is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, and Jeffrey is President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Akhil's new book examines the Constitution's formative period, the years leading up to the ratification in which it took shape, and the next few decades afterward, and the big questions of American purpose, identity, and politics that continue to mold it. This is a thrilling project for me as a scholar of American history and as the curator who oversees one of our most important collections, our library's vast holdings of government documents. NYPL holds some of our country's most treasured materials that reveal the conditional and iterative nature of the origins of American government. Our handwritten copy of the Bill of Rights, which will be displayed in our upcoming Treasures exhibition this fall, is one of at least 14 original copies sent to the states for ratification in 1789, and it includes 2 additional amendments which were never ratified. Beyond showstoppers like the Bill of Rights, the library's collections of proceedings, reports, legal cases, and legislative debates document all that happened after 1789. In these documents lies the everyday workings of our cities, states, and federal bodies since our country's inception through, well, today. If you'd like to access these resources, all you need is an NYPL library card, which you can use also to check out Akhil's book. You can borrow The Words That Made Us for free in physical and electronic formats. Many of our locations have been reopening for grab-and-go service, so you have lots of options on how to get the paper copy. Or you can reserve it on our app, Simply E. Scroll down on this event page for more info. And if you're able, you can buy Akhil's book from the library shop. Proceeds go to benefit the library, and you get a cool lion stamp inside the book. The link to purchase is also in the event page, and we'll drop it into the chat as well. While you're on the event page, you can also check out a list of further reading that Akhil has put together and learn how to access those titles from the library. And since you're already on our website, you should definitely go take a look at our other upcoming events at nypl.org/live. Just next week, Salman Rushdie will be speaking with Taya Obret about his new essay collection. Theodore R. Johnson will be talking to Leah Wright Rigueur about racism in the future of the American promise. Akweke Emeze will be discussing their new memoir with Saida Hartman, and Jamal Jordan is going to be talking about his beautiful new photography book, Queer Love in Color. And there's a lot more throughout June, so go to nypl.org/live, check it all out, and make sure to register. So before I turn it over to tonight's speakers, a few quick housekeeping items. The library values your privacy, so we want you to know that even though the video and chat are available on an NYPL.org page, they are hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you may share data about yourself, which the library does not control. You can learn more by scrolling down on the event page. Also, Akhil is excited to take some of your questions tonight, and you can send them at any time using the chat, Google form, or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. He'll get to as many as he can at the end. And with that, please welcome Jeffrey Rosen and Akhil Reed Amar.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's such a thrill to be here at the New York Public Library, and so exciting to hear about the upcoming display of the Bill of Rights. The National Constitution Center is thrilled to share with New York Public Library that historic copy, one of the 12 original copies of the Bills of Rights. And it was so meaningful for us to display it a few years ago, and it's great that you're going to be displaying it in the fall, and it's just a wonderful example of collaborating so that we can teach America about these founding documents. And friends, there is no teacher in America who has taught all of us more about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights than Akhil Amar. In addition to being one of America's greatest teachers of the Constitution, he's shown himself in his new book to be one of the greatest constitutional historians of our generation. And this book is so moving because Akhil, through his brilliance, has resurrected the words that we, the people, use to debate the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and told the story of the Constitution in a way based on the primary text in a way that no one has done before. In addition to all that, Akhil was my teacher in law school. He inspired my own love of the Constitution, so it's just such a joy for me to unite with him to talk about his brilliant book. We've done it once or twice before, and what I'm so looking forward to tonight is really focusing on the founders themselves, the figures, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, and Jefferson, and what their constitutional contributions were. So Akhil, welcome. It's wonderful to see you. Congratulations again on the book. And let's just begin with Washington. You say there is no question that the Constitution of 1787 was emphatically Washington's constitutions, not Madison's. What do you mean by that?
So let me such a great honor to be with you. And thanks so much to our host at the New York Public Library. My love of all this stuff began in my own public library back in California. Didn't quite have the collection that NYPL has, but thank you so much for everything you do. So here's one thing that was mentioned by you, and by Julia, that there's this copy there are copies of the Bill of Rights, original copies. And most people are taught that Madison is the father of the Constitution, and Madison is the father of the Bill of Rights. And I say, actually, Washington is the moving figure. And here's one way of seeing it, just connecting it to that. How many copies were sent out? The Bill of Rights emerged from the first Congress. Why did it emerge? Because the Constitution was crowdsourced. It was put to the people up and down the continent for a vote. And these brilliant guys at Philadelphia, including Madison, including Washington, had forgotten to put a Bill of Rights in, basically. And why do I say it that way? Because state constitutions, which were up and running before the Philadelphia Convention, almost all of them did have Bills of Rights. And so when the Constitution is being proposed for ratification, ordinary people say, dudes, you forgot the rights. And many of them said, okay, we will vote for the thing. Not because of James Madison. We've never heard of James Madison. Not because of Federalist 10, because no one reads Federalist 10 at the time, which is one of the things I document. Federalist 10 was the 10th op-ed in a series of op-eds written initially in New York to try to persuade people to say yes. They were reprinted in other states, but the 10th essay, which is Madison's first contribution, wasn't reprinted widely, wasn't talked about. The earlier essays they were written mainly by two New Yorkers, Hamilton and Jay, who were very much inspired by George Washington's vision, a geostrategic vision, which we're going to come back to, an idea of national security. Okay, so ordinary people say, who are on the fence, we'll vote for the thing, but not because of James Madison, we've never heard of him, but because of George Washington. We trust him. He had the only effective army on the continent, and he gave it up. He defended us against the British, and he'll do it again if we need to. He can protect us against King George without becoming himself a King George. He's not going to create a throne. He's got no one to give it to. He's got no offspring. So we trust Washington. We're going to vote yes, but we want a Bill of Rights. Fine. Now, the conventional story is, it's Madison's Constitution. He thinks of the idea. No, Washington is the presiding officer at Philadelphia. He's the one that everyone is looking to. People on the fence vote for the Constitution because of Washington. And what does Washington say he's unanimously elected president? The Constitution has a really strong executive branch. Why? Because Washington believes in that. Madison doesn't have a clue about that, but Washington believes in a strong executive, strong union. And what's the first thing that Washington does as he takes his oath of office in New York City, in Lower Manhattan? He says in a pretty short inaugural address, short so it can be reprinted in newspapers, just like the Constitution was reprinted in newspapers, just like the Federalist Papers, these op-eds were reprinted in newspapers. He says, maybe we should consider adopting some amendments, a Bill of Rights, because that's what ordinary people want. He's the one who first says it. Madison implements it in the first Congress by pushing it. And that's the conventional story. Madison is pushing it. But how many copies were actually sent out? And the answer is 13 were originally sent out, even though only 11 states are in the Union. North Carolina has said, no, thank you. North Carolina has not ratified. Neither has Rhode Island. So, nevertheless, 13 copies of the Bill of Rights are sent out. They send one to Rhode Island, even though it's not part of the U.S. When Washington takes his oath of office and the Bill of Rights is drafted. North Carolina is not part of the United States anymore. It's foreign soil. Why send out all 13 to North Carolina and to Rhode Island? Because George Washington is pushing a Bill of Rights largely for union reasons, geostrategic reasons. It's really important to make sure that North Carolina and Rhode Island rejoin the club, because otherwise Britain can use them as bases for military operation. So just the thing that you were just talking about, how many copies of the Bill of Rights actually got circulated? That's connected to Washington's idea of geostrategy. We've got to get everyone on board. Some people voted no in New York. We want them on board. Lots of people voted no in North Carolina and Rhode Island. We want them on board for geostrategic reasons. We want to get everyone back together again. And that's Washington's idea before it was Madison's.
Wow. Thanks for connecting that vision so powerfully to this copy of the Bill of Rights that the New York Public Library is sharing with the Constitution Center. And as Julia said, there are not 10 amendments, but 12. And the original First Amendment wasn't the one dealing with free speech, but one that dealt with representation. It would have provided for one representative in Congress for every 30,000 inhabitants. If that had passed, there'd be something like 4,000 people in Congress today. But what does that say about, to confirm your point about the central concern of the ratifiers of the Bill of Rights too, which was really questions not of rights, but of structure and of union?
So, Jeff was my student long ago, and I actually wrote a book about the Bill of Rights, and I wrote a book about the Constitution. And I keep coming back to this. I see things that I didn't see before. I didn't start my story in my earlier books soon enough. This book starts in 1760. It starts before the Declaration of Independence. And so I get a good long running start into the Declaration of Independence and then later the Constitution. And now that I understand the backstory better than I do, here's why the original First Amendment reads the way it does, because the original First Amendment is about congressional size. Okay, so first, we are going to talk about the famous people, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Adams and so on. But the first three words of the document are "we the people." And we have to remember it was ratified by we the people, the Philadelphia drafters, the people who met just steps from the National Constitution Center in Independence Hall, were only generating a proposal. It would mean nothing at all unless people state by state in special elections, special democratic elections, which more people were allowed to participate than was usually the rule. In New York, all adult female citizens could vote. No race tests, no property tests, no religious tests, no literacy tests. Those aren't the ordinary New York rules, but they're the special rules for this. Yes, we do election. So we have to understand the Constitution does come from the people. That's what the preamble says. The preamble is emblazoned on the front facade of the National Constitution Center, right opposite Independence Hall. So when these brilliant guys at Philadelphia proposed the document with Washington's name on it first, because he's the presiding officer, the people in state after state have two really big reservations. We've already talked about one. They said, you forgot the rights. We want a Bill of Rights for the federal document that looks like, oh, your background here. Actually, you see the National Constitution Center, read the people. Jeff actually heard me and changed his backdrop. So you can see that on the facade. And Jeff knows that I was involved in the founding of the National Constitution Center, and I'm very proud of it. I just love this institution. It's a national treasure like the New York Public Library. Okay, so the ordinary people have two big objections. You forgot a Bill of Rights, and states have bills of rights. Oh, and the Declaration of Independence says that the purpose of government is to secure rights. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's how it begins. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights. So I didn't get a good enough running start into the Constitution in my earlier stuff. I didn't focus as much as I should have. You did in your student note on the Declaration of Independence and the theory of government, behind it. But government exists to secure rights, and you forgot the rights. That's the first thing ordinary people say. And they're looking at state constitutions. Julia mentioned local governments and state governments. So yes, they're a huge part of the process. Before we have the federal constitution, we have state constitutions. What was their second objection? Their second objection, ordinary people, was the House of Representatives is too small. It's supposed to really be representative, but actually, we're not going to know the handful of people who are taxing in our name because the House is too small. And what's their baseline? State constitution. So let's just think about it the following way. There are 65 members of the first House of Representatives, if all 13 states are in. Remember, North Carolina and Rhode Island haven't said yes. 65 for the whole continent. Only 2 states have state assemblies that are 65 or smaller, okay? So the Congress is smaller than that of almost every state assembly. That looks weird. If you go up and down the continent, there are 1,500 state assemblymen in the 13 states, if you add them all up. 1,300 at the state level, 65 at the federal level. That's just a mismatch. It looks too, in a word, unrepresentative. So they say, ordinary people, we want our Congress to look a little bit more like our state legislatures. Why? Again, I didn't fully understand all this before, but now I have running start. Parliament wasn't representative. It was just far off and distant and was trying to tax us. And we said it's not representative. And some people in Britain said, oh, well, why don't you send a few Americans to Parliament? Maybe that'll be okay. And the Americans say, a few won't do it. They won't really look like America if you just have a few people far away. That's the same objection, in a way, that ordinary people have to the original Constitution. The House is too small. Now, then if that's all true, Jeff, you might say, well, then why didn't the First Amendment that was proposed get ratified? It was ratified by almost every state that said yes to the other amendments, but one said no. Delaware, a small state that doesn't want a big House of Representatives, it wants a small House of Representatives, so it can be, it wants a House of Representatives of 13 people, so it could have, one person from Delaware and one from Virginia and one from New York, regardless of state size. But it also becomes unnecessary because as soon as there's a first census, the Congress, even without the First Amendment, expands the House size. So they get it. They hear ordinary people in the ratification process and they start to make adjustments, because if they don't, they're going to be voted out, because it really is a democracy. It really is electorally accountable. Final point, the House of Representatives now is directly elected every 2 years in a way that actually in the Articles of Confederation, you didn't get to vote for the Confederation Congress, but now you will get to vote for the House. And if James Madison doesn't give you the rights that you want and structural changes like a bigger House of Representatives, but soon, pronto, you're going to vote him out of office. And he understands that, and other people understand that. And George Washington, in his inaugural address, is saying, listen to what people said in the ratification process. The two biggest objections that ordinary people had to the Constitution is no Bill of Rights, the House is too small.
Wow. I'm so glad I asked, and I learned so much from you every time I do. And now I understand the original First Amendment even more powerfully. So let's talk about Madison. And you say that Federalist 8, emphasizing the importance of national union for national defense, is more important than Federalist 10, where Madison talks about the dangers of factions or mobs animated by passion rather than reason. But you taught me, and others do, that Federalist 10 is important. It was responding to the fears of Shays' Rebellion, these mobs that are surrounding the federal courthouses because debtors don't want to pay their debts. And Madison also is very attuned to the importance of public opinion, which you emphasize in the book. And he hopes that a group of literati, of enlightened journalists, will use these new printing presses and newspapers that you say are central to the whole debate to allow the cool voice of reason to disseminate across the large republic. On balance, what is Madison's distinctive constitutional contribution?
Well, scholars love Madison because Madison is very scholarly, and he believes in reason, and he has actually original ideas like, democracy will work better if it's large rather than small. Well, that's interesting, and it might even be true, especially there are some people, especially after the Civil War, many people who trust the federal government more to protect rights. So Madison has really interesting ideas, but ordinary people at the time don't listen to him quite. You look at the history of the world, you haven't had a big democracy, really. Democracies that have existed, and there haven't been very many in the history of the world prior to the 1770s. But the ones that existed typically were tiny little city-states, ancient Athens, pre-imperial Rome. So Madison has a new idea, and it's really interesting, and it's in Federalist 10. Federal government's going to be better. It's going to be better protecting minority rights. And after the Civil War, this looks like a genius idea. Today, lots of scholars pick up on it. Madison's concerned about economic minorities, the propertied, creditors. But today, people say, religious minorities need to be protected. Ethnic minorities need to be protected. So Madison looks really prophetic and very scholarly, and so scholars love him, and they glom onto 10. But at the time, as I said, no one read 10. We know that because Julia mentioned actually all the archives of the New York Public Library. There are lots of old newspapers there and other places, and now our audience can actually access some of these newspapers online, and we can see which Federalist papers were reprinted and which ones weren't. And Federalist 10 wasn't broadly reprinted, and people weren't really talking about it so much. Rather, here's what they were talking about, and this is more connected to Washington and to Hamilton and to the early Federalist papers. Federalist 8, written by the New Yorker, Alexander Hamilton, summarizing the arguments of the Federalist 2 through 7. So Madison says, vote for the federal government because democracy will work better on a continental scale. And it will protect against the rabble. And ordinary people aren't so sure about that. Here's Hamilton's argument, which is Washington's argument. Vote for the Constitution because we need to join together militarily, because if we don't, Britain will slice us to ribbons. Britain almost won the Revolutionary War. It took 8 years, a lot of deaths. We won it because of a triple bank shot at Yorktown. There were 2 French warriors for every American warrior at Yorktown, and we can't count on the French in the future. Do not count on the French. Do not count on anyone else. We have to be able to protect ourselves. And yes, the Brits might try to come back again. They still control Canada. Maybe the French will decide that they want to get back in the game and switch sides. Remember, America fought against the French in the 1750s and the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and then against the Brits. But who knows? Maybe the Spanish want to get back into the game, or the French. We have to be able to defend ourselves. And the only way we can do that is to create a continental union, an indivisible union, a geostrategic union of all the states, including, by the way, North Carolina and Rhode Island. So Washington understands we got to get them all on board, because otherwise Britain can use one of them as a military base to invade other states, and then there won't be liberty. That's the argument of the early Federalist Papers, especially Hamilton in the Federalist Age. He's been arguing as a continentalist from the beginning. Why does Hamilton see this? Why does Washington see this? Because they were at Valley Forge. They were at Yorktown. They understood the military crisis that really did exist. And Madison didn't quite, because he didn't serve. And Jefferson didn't quite understand that viscerally because he didn't serve. Back to Shays' Rebellion, last point. So some people say, Shays' Rebellion is all about the masses getting out of control, and we need enlightened people who are going to resist passion and mobs and all the rest, and that's Federalist 10. Okay, that's one way of thinking about Shays' Rebellion. Here's a different way. Shays' Rebellion were people taking up arms against a duly elected government, like the insurrection or the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. That's not a good thing. Resisting Parliament is one thing. You didn't vote for Parliament. You're not voting for the king. But resisting a duly elected government, this is not good. But here's the different way of thinking of Shays' Rebellion. Washington thinks that the Brits are behind Shays' Rebellion. They're actually encouraging the rebellion so that they can pick up the pieces when America falls apart. Remember, this is in the backcountry of Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, which is not very far from Canada. Washington thinks that Britain is trying to rile up the Indians in the backcountry against America. Britain is trying to rile up the farmers against a duly elected regime. So he sees Shays' Rebellion through a geostrategic prism. Just like today we say, is Ukraine trying to mess with federal US elections, or is Russia trying to mess with us, or the Chinese trying to mess with us? That's a different way of thinking about Shays' Rebellion. It's much more in keeping with Hamilton and Washington and geostrategy and the early Federalist Papers, which is different than what Madison sees.
So clear, so powerful, and you sum it up so well when you say, my view is simple and straightforward. The Constitution of 1787 was a direct, logical, and proportionate response to the basic failures of the Articles, period. Okay, let's talk about Hamilton. He's one of your great heroes in this book, and he played a central part, you say, in the chapters you call consolidation, whereas Washington's most trusted advisor, he argues for national policies and makes constitutional positions that the Marshall Court would come to embrace, including justifying the constitutionality of a bank, of taxes, and of a strong military. Tell us why you believe that Hamilton is a constitutional hero.
My book is dedicated to 5 people, and several of them are New Yorkers, and one is Lynn Miranda. And one is Lynn's spouse, Vanessa Nadal. And one is Ron Chernow, the great biographer of Hamilton. And I didn't know these folks at all 3 years ago. And I was introduced to them by one of my very favorite students of all time, whose name is Neil Katyal, who also happens to be Jeff's brother-in-law. And way back when, I introduced Neil to Jeff. And at a certain point after they became friends, I think Jeff said, you know, I've got a sister, you might like to meet her. And that's Joanna, and Neil married Joanna. So Neil introduced me to Lynn Miranda, and introduced me to Ron Chernow, and introduced me to Vanessa Nadal, all New Yorkers. And they are singing the song of a great New Yorker named Alexander Hamilton. And in that opening act, I went and saw Lynn for charity with Neil. I went down to Puerto Rico. Neil invited me to reprise his role as Alexander Hamilton. And it was brilliant. It was life-changing. It was transformative. It so moved me. And in that first opening scene, he says, in New York, you can be your own man. So Hamilton comes to New York and reinvents himself, because that's the greatness of America. He's born in the middle of nowhere, but he comes to New York, and it's the land of opportunity. And Lynn gets that, because he's a New Yorker. He has connections to Puerto Rico through his family. So he's kind of a little bit like Hamilton, an inside outsider. He understands New York, but he also understands what the world looks like, you know, in the Caribbean. And so Hamilton is a nationalist above all, because Madison is a total Virginian all the way, lives and dies basically, you know, in Virginia, and Jefferson's a Virginian. Washington will become a great nationalist. He's from Virginia, but he saves the North as a military hero in Boston. He spends a lot of time in the West. He's a national figure, but Hamilton most of all because he doesn't really have a loyalty to just one state or another. He's an American. He's a continentalist. So that's one thing. And America, he's very low born. What does Lynn Miranda say? How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman. So he's low born, and in America he can rise as high as his talents allow. In New York, you can be your own man. I mean, and it's all in that first song, which, by the way, moves from hip hop, which is a New York phenomenon, to Broadway show tunes. By the end of that first thing, all the musical genre very much in New York. New York for Hamilton is a metaphor for all America, because Virginia is pretty parochial. They're basically people who came over from the Midlands of England. They're Cavaliers and Episcopalians. They're basically just Brit types. And in New England, they're basically Puritan Roundheads. But New York, it used to be New Amsterdam. You got the Dutch, you got the Swedes, you got the Germans, you got all sorts of religions, and eventually you're going to get Jewish Americans and Irish Americans. So New York is an embodiment of the diversity of America, and Hamilton sees that and feels that, and he understands national security, and for that you need actually to pay for the army. He understands banks. Jefferson doesn't understand banks. Madison doesn't understand banks, but Hamilton, he understands banks, and it shouldn't be called Madison Avenue. It's Hamilton Avenue, in Manhattan, and he understands commerce and trade, and New York. He understands shipping. Madison doesn't understand these things. He understands warfare, trade, law. He's a lawyer. Commerce. He understands how all these things fit together. He creates, with Washington's backing, a great nation able to defend itself against the Brits, against, if necessary, the French, against the Spanish. He's a real hero, and he's a New York hero.
Wonderful. So great to hear you speak about him so movingly. When I was in law school, in your class, as you remember, as we both remember, someone dared me to stand up and exclaim, Jefferson was the Antichrist. And I did that, and you were initially baffled, but we explained the joke and you took it in good humor. And that's not quite the thesis of this book, but you're quite hard on Jefferson, who fought with your heroes, with Hamilton, with Marshall, and you believe was wrong on many of the central constitutional questions. Tell us why you paint an ambivalent picture of the constitutional legacy of Thomas Jefferson.
And I changed my mind on that. And it's always complicated when you're talking about Jefferson with people named Jeff, because they do in some ways with Jefferson. But if you had met me at age 20, I would have told you, oh, if I'm lucky enough ever to have a son, I'm going to name him Jefferson. So, I begin actually, and I thought, oh, Hamilton is just a money guy. He's an elitist or something. And Jefferson, oh, the man of the people. So I begin as a Jeffersonian in my own autobiography. And here are still some things that I do say in the book about Jefferson's greatness. He understands the need for religious liberty, freedom of the mind, as does Madison. He early on says we got to have a Bill of Rights. He gets it from day one. He's not at Philadelphia, and he's haranguing Madison in letters from Paris saying, where are the rights? Where are the rights? Where are the rights? He actually persuades Madison of the necessity of this. He champions, along with Madison, free expression when John Adams makes it a crime to criticize John Adams and to criticize the federal government. He's going to be a president who doubles the national landmass, protects national security through the Louisiana Purchase, which is one of the most epic constitutional decisions ever. So these are very important accomplishments. With Madison, he creates a political party. They call themselves the Republicans or the Democratic Republicans. Today, we call them the Democrats. They become the party of Andrew Jackson, will become later the party of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama and Joe Biden. So that's a pretty impressive accomplishment. This is the dominant political party in America until Abraham Lincoln. And so Jefferson is a politically brilliant. He's a great poet and he believes in all sorts of romantic, utopian reforms. He dreams of a better world, especially as a young man. He believes in religious toleration and equality, strong, robust free speech. At the end of the day, he does protect national security with the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, all that said, and I still believe all of that. He starts out anti-slavery and he becomes increasingly an apologist for slavery. He starts out saying we should prohibit slavery in the West. He's the author of an original Northwest Ordinance prohibiting slavery in the West. By the end of his life, he says, oh, we should spread slavery to the West. Like spreading the virus will somehow be a good idea. No, it won't. Why does he say that? And Madison too, he starts out championing the Northwest Ordinance as a young man and then ends up saying, oh, the Missouri Compromise is bad, indeed unconstitutional, because it is excluding slavery from the West, because they created a political party. And the political party has a Southern base. They needed that party to defeat John Adams. But then having created that party, they stuck with the base, even at the expense of principle. People today, is Liz Cheney going to go with the base or go with principle? On the Democratic side, are people going to pander to the base, or are they going to actually do the right thing? So we have these issues today, but Jefferson deteriorates on slavery. He starts out as an idealist and he ends up a slavocrat. He never frees his slaves in death. Washington does. He doesn't follow, the Washington model. He says silly things like that a bank is unconstitutional. No, a bank is not unconstitutional, and you need it for national security. And he doesn't understand banks. He's unfair to Hamilton. He's disloyal to Washington. He's Washington's cabinet minister, and he's secretly, while a cabinet minister, plotting against Washington's administration policies, the Jay Treaty, the Neutrality Proclamation, the bank. Some of these he actually endorsed in cabinet meetings, the Neutrality Proclamation, and then secretly he tells people like Madison, attack this in the press. He's a disloyal cabinet, and fine, if you don't agree with Washington's policies, fine, but then you have to tell Washington and resign. You can't stay in his cabinet and undermine him that way. And it's Washington's Constitution, you see. If you start with that idea that the Constitution was really written as a practical matter by and for George Washington, then Hamilton is loyal to Washington, and Jefferson isn't. At the end of his life, In retirement, Washington sends not a single letter in retirement to Madison or Jefferson. And he's sending letter after letter to and receiving letter after letter from Alexander Hamilton. His two most consistent correspondents at the end of his life are two people who was aides de camp as a military officer and in his administration, McHenry, Fort McHenry fame, and Alexander Hamilton. So not good on slavery and deteriorating, not good on loyalty to Washington, a bit of a hypocrite, saying certain things but doing other things. So those are some of the reasons that that Jefferson dropped in my estimation, even though he's up there on Mount Rushmore. And if you read the book, you understand why.
Well, you make a very strong case that the arc of someone's life is significant in evaluating their constitutional legacy. And you say, as they aged and approached the end, Franklin and Washington got better on the slavery question, and Jefferson and Madison got worse. This is a broader, tough question, but what connection do you think there is, if any, between personal virtue and constitutional achievement?
The framers cared a lot about virtue. It's a word that appears over and over in their discourse. I think they focused less on, but virtue can mean different things. Private sexual morality. That's not quite what they meant by virtue, although they do think being loyal, to your spouse is a good thing. And Hamilton is ashamed of his weakness of the flesh. He mans up and admits it, though. Thomas Jefferson, you see, is not honest. He says, "Oh, I never had any relations with Sally Hemings." And one of the books I recommended to our audience is Annette Gordon-Reed's brilliant Hemingses of Monticello. So Hamilton's more honest, but I don't think they were focusing on sexual morality quite. Abigail Adams really distrusts Hamilton because she thinks he's basically, a skirt chaser, a philanderer. And Martha Washington names her Tomcat Hamilton, actually. Because Hamilton is, but here's what they really meant by virtue. What they meant: service to the Republic, willingness to sacrifice your own interests for the greater collective good. Someone like John Adams, who has all sorts of flaws, but his country tells him they want him to go off halfway across the world and be separated from his wife and family for years, and he does it because he's just a faithful public servant. And Washington serves the Revolutionary Army for 8 years. He's away from Mount Vernon. He doesn't accept pay for his service, just a compensation of his out-of-pocket expenses, and then he disbands the army. They thought what virtue was all about was serving the Republic even at the expense of your own self-interest. And Aaron Burr doesn't have that kind of virtue. Aaron Burr is in it for himself. He'll sell the government out to the highest bidder if he can make money off of it. And that's why he lacked virtue. It wasn't that he was promiscuous, although he was. It's that he did not have this Roman-like sense of ancient Rome, sacrifice for the public good, the public weal, the common good. That's what they thought virtue was all about, a lifetime of public service.
You mentioned Adams, and he's the last of the big five who we haven't talked about. The book begins with Adams in 1763 and the writs of assistance controversy, and yet you argue that because of his overweening egoism and vanity, his constitutional contributions were ultimately limited. Give us a sense of the legacy of John Adams.
He's the only president early on who fails to be reelected, and that's kind of a bit of a disgrace. And he does so because he's too thin-skinned. He makes it a crime to criticize John Adams. He signs that bill into law, and he ruthlessly prosecutes people basically whose offense is just quite tame. They're not plotting treason or anything like that. They're just saying, we disagree with John Adams's policies. So that's why he's thrown out of office, and it gnaws away at him. Here's some things that are to be said in his behalf. He gives his life for his country. He is an embodiment of virtue. He marries an amazing woman, a smart woman, and he listens to her. And Abigail Adams is a really interesting person. And because they're separated for so much of their life, we have amazing correspondence, and you can read it. And the National Archives Founders Online, you can see these hundreds of letters back and forth. Unfortunately for John Adams, he can't be with his beloved, but fortunately for us, we can actually see the relationship back and forth because actually they're separated. Abigail, unfortunately, is just too loyal to John Adams and encourages him to go after his enemies. She feels it too personally. She's too close to him. He's not a great team player. John Adams isn't. And ultimately, the Constitution is a team project. Jefferson and Madison team up. Hamilton and Washington team up. Sean Marshall and Joseph Story team up. Adams is a loner. He's very independent. Independence for him is independence even from his own father, who wanted him to be a preacher. And it's a very fiercely personal independence, but it makes it difficult for him to trust his cabinet officers and confide in them and listen to them. Difficult to work with other people to create a political coalition, call it a party if you like. Difficult to really listen to other people well. He's not a great listener, not a great team player, and Washington is a great listener.
There are two other figures you devote chapters to, and those are Marshall and Jackson. And it's very moving to see how Marshall is taking the words that made us, which bubbled up in these popular debates, were put in briefs by Hamilton, and then enshrines them into the supreme law. Tell us about the contributions of Marshall and how so many of them are based in text and words.
Yes, and I also should mention the great Ben Franklin. He dies in 1790, so he's a less central person as my story continues, but I do tell the story at the end of his life. His last great message to America is we should end slavery. He actually introduces an abolitionist petition in Congress. And before that, he's the president of an abolition society. The rest of the world had slavery. Slavery does not begin in 1619. It's an ancient thing. You see it in the Old Testament. You see it in the New Testament. It's in Ben-Hur. It's in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And Ben-Hur is about a slave becoming free. And A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum is about a slave, winning his freedom. The ancient world had an idea of emancipation, manumission, but not of abolishing slavery everywhere. Americans in 1775 championed for the first time in world history the idea of abolishing slavery. The first anti-slavery society in the world is 1775 Pennsylvania. And after the American Revolution, a bunch of the northern states get rid of slavery. And Ben Franklin becomes president of that abolitionist society. And in his last act, he actually writes a satire saying we have to get rid of slavery, and he introduces an anti-slavery petition. So I don't want to let Franklin drop.
Sorry, can I just jump in, because I'm glad you mentioned Franklin, and so we stay in chronological order. Just one of our friends in the Q&A asks, on virtue, where do you put Franklin? And of course, Franklin in the 1730s wrote his famous list of 13 virtues. He said he resolved to arrive at the idea of moral perfection, and channeling Pythagoras and Daniel Defoe, wrote down a series of classical virtues and tried to live up to them. So how well did he do throughout his life?
Yeah, and again, if we measure him by his sexual behavior, we might, be disappointed. And John Adams, who's very competitive and very envious, is annoyed that everyone seems to love Franklin, and Adams wants everyone to love Adams. And in Paris, Franklin is ridiculously flirtatious, and who knows if he was completely faithful to his spouse, and he sires an illegitimate child, William. So if you judge them by private sexual conduct, Franklin won't look so great. But Franklin really believes in moral improvement in general. He gets better over time. On slavery, he once owned slaves, but by the end, he's an ardent abolitionist. He believes in human improvement and human progress, and he's always trying to do things for his fellow humans, creating, this is really important, not just bifocals, which are essential, or a Franklin stove or a lightning rod, which are really helpful for ordinary people, reducing pollution, the Franklin stove, and that's like climate change, and the lightning rod, prevents fires and all the rest. So not just that, but a secular university, University of Pennsylvania, but today we should mention a lending library. Franklin creates that in your city, Philadelphia, and a volunteer fire department. So he's always trying to create things for the betterment of humankind. And that really is extraordinary. And his political contributions are in the same register. Now, he dies first. So he's the first one to go. In my last chapter, I kind of bring all my characters back on stage and kill them all off. Now, this is, just, I'm speaking rhetorically, they died, unfortunately, but I tell the stories of their deaths. And Marshall is, I call him the last founder. He's not technically the last to die. That's James Madison in 1836. So Franklin goes first, 1790, then Washington, 1799, Hamilton killed in a duel, 1804, Jefferson and Madison amazingly die the same day, 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence that they co-wrote on July 4, 1776. And then Madison's the last to die. But Madison has been in retirement since 1817. Marshall, on the other hand, who was a founder, he was there at Valley Forge with Hamilton and Washington and helped get the Constitution ratified, and saying it's a very democratic document in Virginia. He's on the Supreme Court for 34 years, from 1801 to 1835. And so he's in power all the way, almost all the way to the end of my story. And what's his great, and whereas, again, most of them are dead by then, and the only one who's not at the very end is Madison, but he's just in retirement. Marshall's great contribution is to sing the song of the Constitution, to tell people, here's what George Washington was trying to accomplish. And Marshall was the first biographer of Washington. Here's what Hamilton was trying to do. So Marshall is a great interpreter of the Constitution, telling us how to read it holistically, purposefully, enduringly. And he's a great nationalist figure. And who's his partner? Joseph Story. The best partnerships, the strongest, combine different regions. So Washington and Hamilton, Washington's Virginia, Hamilton's sort of, a middle states, New York, or Washington and Adams to some extent, Massachusetts and Virginia. Marshall is a Massachusetts guy, and he teams up with Marshall is, a Virginian, and he teams up with a Massachusetts guy, Joseph Story. So America is at its strongest when Massachusetts and Virginia are working together. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in 1776, James Otis and Patrick Henry in the 1760s. The greatest northern state, Harvard, Massachusetts, the greatest slave state, Virginia, William and Mary. That's when America works at its best. Marshall is a team player. He leads the Supreme Court as a team. He finds his Hamilton, he's trying to emulate Washington. Washington found Hamilton. He finds Joseph Story, and he's a good team player. See, Adams, not so much. So that's John Marshall. He's the last founder.
Wonderful. And because he's so important, and the book ends with him, Jackson, not a simple states' rights guy, not a crude populist vulgarian, but an important constitutional figure. Why?
Self-made, orphaned at a young age, kind of an only in America story, strong believer in national defense. All your early presidents are battlefield generals and or secretaries of state, or in John Adams' case, America's leading diplomat under the Articles of Confederation. Until Lincoln, no person other than James Polk. Every elected president was either Secretary of State or battlefield general, all the way until Lincoln. Half the people who are secretaries of state for 4 years become presidents of the United States. It's a national security office. Washington can defend us against the Brits. So can Jackson. He beats the Brits in the Battle of New Orleans. He's a national security person. He believes in a strong, indivisible union. None of this nullification stuff, none of this secession stuff. So he carries that Washington, Hamilton flag of union forward, which will be Lincoln's flag. Now, he's not perfect. I'm most critical of him when it comes, he believes in ordinary people, the common man, a Jeffersonian theme. He himself is self-made in the tradition of Hamilton. My biggest critique is he's very pro-slavery. So the Constitution starts off with an increasingly embarrassed slaveholder, Washington, who will free his slaves at the end, to actually, unfortunately, and increasingly, then we go to the next really big president, an increasingly unembarrassed slaveholder, Jefferson, who won't free his slaves at the end, to a defiant, proud slaveholder who doesn't apologize for slavery and doesn't inherit slaves the way Washington does or Jefferson does, buys them and sells them, for his own profit. And so that's Jackson's biggest failing, is his pro-slavery stance. But he is a great American nationalist and a defender of national security and on indivisibility and secession. He's great. I'll say one other thing, because we have to talk about Native Americans, which we haven't. Yes, his track record is very bad on that, with a Trail of Tears. But he doesn't hate Indians. He hates tribes that war against the United States and ally, the French and Indian War, they allied with the French in the 1750s against Americans, and then with the British in the 1770s, and then again in the War of 1812. As late as the Civil War, many Indian tribes are going to ally with the Confederacy. That's what Jackson hates. But individual Indians, no. And here's something that I actually tell the reader that I didn't know, I just learned. He adopts a little Red Stick Creek Indian orphan boy and raises him as his own, Lincoya Jackson. He himself was a war orphan. So, and he would never do that for Black people. He's racist when it comes to Blacks and a proud slaveholder. But when it came to Native Americans, he actually respected them. He just wanted them to become Americans rather than tribal nations that might ally with America's European enemies and as it were, stab America in the back in a war or something like that. So he's a very complicated character, and I try to tell that complexity. He's not, at the top of my list, but if you had asked me 3 years ago, are you going to say anything nice about Jackson? I'd say, of course not. And I came to see, there are some things where Jackson's important. He's a role model for Lincoln when it comes to indivisible union.
Wow. It's so exciting to hear you talk about what you learned about Jackson that you hadn't known, and how you changed your mind about Jefferson, all because of your resurrection of the primary text. And you told me how you would get up earlier in the middle of the night with some new database that you wanted to look at to find new words and evidence. And you talk in this book about how you have exciting new data about the newspapers showed how printers mocked the Stamp Act by refusing to print it on stamp paper. What I'd love you to share with us is you always, since I was your student, and I'm still your student, but when I was in your class, you believed the Constitution was national, that we, the people of the United States as a whole, created it, and that it was formed to remedy the defects of the Articles of Confederation. But this book, I think, has reinforced that view. And what I want to ask you is, what in your excavations surprised you and taught you something new that reinforced your view about the fundamentally national character of the Constitution?
Well, again, because I'm starting my story earlier, America doesn't begin as a nation. It begins as separate colonies that aren't even talking to each other. It would be, they share a common king, but nothing else. Boston isn't talking to Williamsburg, isn't talking to Charleston. They're all talking to London, but they're not talking to each other. An analogy would be the British Empire in the British Commonwealth in 1930. Well, there's India, there's New Zealand, there's Australia, there's Canada, there's Northern Ireland, there's Kenya, but they're not really talking to each other. They just have a common monarch, King George, or something like that. That's what America was at the beginning of my book. 13 separate colonies, maybe talking to London, but not to each other. And what I learned by reading newspapers, which are now online. Our audience, if they go to the New York Public Library, can use the New York Public Library's subscription to America's historical newspapers. They're not quite free for everyone, the way the National Archives Founders Online is free for everyone, or the Library of Congress database, Century of Lawmaking, is free for everyone. So the American newspapers is by subscription, but I'm sure the New York Public Library has a subscription, and you can now, access every American newspaper on any day ever written. It's word searchable. It's not perfect word searchability. You can see these things for yourself. It's a facsimile print. And when I did, I began to see how Americans talked themselves into becoming a people, with all sorts of anonymous speech and people who aren't famous writing letters to the editors, squibs, doggerel, poems, jumping into the conversation. It's very robust, uninhibited, wide open, raucous. It's very participatory, but now they're beginning to talk to each other. Charleston and Philadelphia and New York and Boston are beginning to realize, oh, we have some things in common. Britain is mistreating all of us, and we need to have a common front. Join or die. That's actually what the great printer, Benjamin Franklin, he creates the first political cartoon in 1754. He's a publisher, and it goes viral. It's a meme that goes up and down the continent and then over to London, and it sticks around for 20 years. So what I learned using these primary sources is you're a journalist. I understood in a way that I never did before, just how important newspapers are, the media is, America's constitutional conversation, how bottom up it is, how participatory it is. Adams tries to shut it down and he gets tossed out. George III isn't listening. He isn't reading American newspapers and he's deposed. So that's, I think, America's Constitution is short, so it can be published in newspapers. And you have at the National Constitution Center a version of the first printing in the Pennsylvania packet of the Constitution. All the state constitutions are short, and they're all reprinted in full in newspapers. And then they get circulated. A newspaper from Virginia gets republished in Massachusetts, like retweeting. And so you can borrow ideas from other places. This is Louis Brandeis's idea. I know you're a big Brandeis fan. You've written a great book on Brandeis. States as laboratories, and one state comes up with an idea and another state, because it's in a newspaper that gets retweeted, can copy this and copy the idea. So the Virginia Declaration of Rights can influence the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, can influence ultimately the Federal Bill of Rights, which is then going to be sent to all the states, as Julia began us with. And it's all because of newspapers. And that's what I'm seeing in a way that I didn't before. Newspapers make America, America.
Beautiful. Through America's constitutional conversation, Americans talk themselves into becoming a people. What an inspiring end to our conversation, which must end on time, as all of our conversations do. But the great pleasure, Akhil, is that our conversation is ongoing, and I cannot wait for the next one, for inspiring me, all of your students, and hundreds of thousands and millions of students of the Constitution across America and around the world, Akhil, with this beautiful book. I want to thank you, friends who've been listening. Educate yourself and spread the light and read Akhil's book, and you will grow in learning and wisdom, and will be so grateful to Akhil for having taught us about the basic principles that unite us as we the people. Akhil, thank you, and till the next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We are showing closing slides. This slide contains an image of the featured title. The background appears to be an aged parchment paper with the title in large print with 2 lines in blue and red below. The text reads, Akhil Reed Amar, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. The Words That Made Us is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with the New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows live from NYPL upcoming events. Tuesday, June 8th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Spirit First, a Kweke Amazee with Saidiya Hartman, produced in partnership with the Schomburg Center Literary Festival. Wednesday, June 9th, 1 p.m. Eastern. Racism and the American Promise, Theodore R. Johnson with Leah Wright Rigueur. Wednesday, June 9th, 7 p.m. Eastern. Languages of Truth, Salman Rushdie with Taya Abrat. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.